First off, a small but helpful thing. We now have a new link handler in TYPO3 for phone numbers. If you go to the CK editor and enter a phone number, you can directly insert it as link to phone apps. So, as you can see here, you just put in the link and then your users can directly open their phone app in the front end when clicking on it. So in my case, this is the desktop app, but on a mobile website, you could just directly make the call. There have been multiple smaller changes for editors to make their life easier when working with TYPO3 on a daily basis. For example, just a quick thing is that you can now hide in menu or show in menu directly through the context menu on the page tree, instead of having to go and edit the page properties every time you just want to exclude a page from menu or not. Additionally, we also implemented a filter for the new content element wizard to make finding a content element, especially on web pages with lots of content elements, easier. Another thing that happened here is that content elements that don't have any configuration are directly inserted and you don't have to configure things. Like, for example, the image just has the normal editor form, and as you saw, the divider element didn't. So divider elements are not directly inserted because they don't have any configuration. And you can do the same thing with your content elements if you have those that don't have custom configuration. Another pretty old module got some new features in TYPO3 version 10. The info module now displays SEO properties in the page tree overview. So you can go to the SEO tab and see all the settings for the current page or multiple levels in an overview. You can also do the same thing with the social media settings, so you can see the Twitter description or title. And you can also directly edit what you see here. So, for example, I have a wrong URL and I can edit this directly and try to correct it. And one feature a lot of people asked for is that after you rename a URL, not only the URL is renamed, but also a redirect should be created from an SEO perspective to avoid broken links. And this is now happening in the background. A redirect was created from the old slug to the new one. Additionally, if you have subpages, those will be renamed too if they share the same slug. The TYPO3 system extension form has gotten some nice improvements and new features in TYPO3 version 10. The form creation wizard has been completely reworked. So if we go to the forms module and add a new form, we will get a new wizard that allows us to either create our form from a template or start with a blank form. We can navigate back and forth in that wizard and get an overview of the form before its creation. By the way, the whole wizard can also be used in your own backend modules, the JavaScript API. In the form editor itself, there also were some improvements made. For example, let's say we want to edit the title. So we can now just double click and change it, and the whole view will be updated automatically. Another thing is that we can now add multiple email addresses to the email finisher, either as recipients or BCC, CC. Just enter multiple contacts here and the email will get sent to all of them. This is something a lot of people were waiting for. And we are happy to now be able to include that. And if you look at the whole form wizard thing in combination with a creation of the content element, so we are now inserting the form, of course, and selecting the form we just created. You just need a little less than 2 minutes to create a full contact form from the first opening of the wizard to displaying it on your website. In my case with stupid looking CSS, but anyway. So it's pretty fast. While these improvements are targeted mainly at editors, there has been another major improvement targeted at developers and integrators for Form. So let me just mention that here too. One of the hard things about Form was that while it's incredibly flexible, it's hard to keep an overview of all the configuration files and what configuration is actually taken. So this has been changed a bit. There is now a single central configuration file that you can open to see the full core form configuration. So if you open the core form configuration file, you have one file only, and that's it. Additionally, we also inserted a configuration module to actually be able to view the configuration that is currently used. As you can see, you have the form YAML configuration option here and can check all the files that get included. That will make my life so much easier. In the previous section, we looked at changes for editors mainly. But what changed for administrators? If you're an administrator, let me tell you that there are some nice little changes that are making your life a bit easier. Let's take a look first at the admin section of the backend. For example, in the environment module, we now have the application context. So you can find it there or on top in the system toolbar. In the system toolbar, you also have the last scheduler run displayed, so you can quickly check whether the scheduler is running as expected or not. In the settings area, we did another improvement, which for those of you using TYPO3 for a lot of years is probably nothing new, but for new users, this hopefully helps to understand how to configure TYPO3 caches. We have added 2 presets for caching in the database or in the file system and added an explanation of which cache does what. Some new feature toggles were also introduced. For example, the fluid page module can be enabled or disabled. Then we have some security related feature toggles, for example, the backend enforced referrer check here, or the rearranged redirect middleware, which switches the order of middlewares around depending on what kind of setup you might have. So if you want to have the redirects done first before you get redirected to your base of your website, then you can toggle that checkbox. In the extension manager, you can now see quickly which extensions are local extensions or which are system extensions, which makes a lot of sense if you just want to figure out which of these are custom installed, and all the system extensions just confuse the issue. So you can now toggle or sort by the extension type to make this a bit easier to see. Another module that got lots of improvements in TYPO3 version 10 is the backend users module. You can now compare backend users like Mumfred and Horst here and see how they are configured. So for example, if one of them works and the other doesn't, you can use this comparison to see why that might be. You can do the exact same thing here with the backend user groups, which also works with more than 2 of them, but I just have these 2 in my development environment. You can see all the modules, the differences in the page permissions or page types, and you would also see tsconfig options. So this is an easy way to find out what the differences are and what the groups are actually meant to be for. And then we did another thing, which is probably not so much an improvement for administrators, to be honest, because if you now switch to a user and edit content in their name, for example, like what I'm doing here, I'm thinking about I could delete that page directly or just, I don't know, let's edit the title here. So I did that and simulated horse while I was at it. And in previous versions, now the log would say horse did it. And in current TYPO3 versions, this is no longer the case. Now there is the wire test, so it's clear that he isn't to blame for that change, but I am. So probably more an improvement for the editors who want to say it wasn't me. But anyway, nice thing, I think. There have been additional improvements done to the command line interface of TYPO3. First of all, it now shows the current application context like we did in the environment module and the system toolbar. The reference index now, when you update, shows a progress bar for each table. And the scheduler runner is able to run multiple tasks at once. So as you can see, I'm doing 2 tasks at once here. And both were test tasks, by the way. So also only smaller changes, but things that are helpful in the day-to-day business. Let's get a bit more technical now with the improvements for developers and integrators. We're going to start with a few small changes. With backend customization, you can, for example, now configure which of these buttons is available separately. So for example, if you want to disable only the select and upload file button, but allow the add media by URL, that's fine and possible now. Additionally, you can now configure groups for the select elements, so you get more structure here and a lot more overview without having to do weird hacks in the configuration. And in all select multiple side-by-side fields, the filter element is always available. You don't need to configure that in TCA anymore. It just didn't make sense to not display that in some cases. Frontend login has been a part of the TYPO3 core for a long time. It allows to have access restricted sections behind the login out of the box. However, the extension hadn't been refactored in a long time, a really long time. It was one of the last parts in TYPO3 that still used marker-based templating. I mean, in 2019. A few years ago, already during the TYPO3 version 9 development cycle, I think, a team formed wanting to change that. And originally it sounded to me like, okay, let's just change from marker-based to fluid templates, but it quickly became a full rewrite of the whole extension as quite a bit had changed in the PHP world in the meantime, so a rewrite was actually more in line with getting it up to speed. The extension is now based on XSpace and Fluid, so it's in line with all the other stuff in the core and out there, and probably you have seen something like it already, even if you're new to TYPO3, and templates can be written in Fluid as we are used to. We were pretty careful to not break stuff during the update and try to get it compatible to all the old implementations around. But there is a feature flag to enable or disable the new extension because we cannot guarantee that it works in all the cases. There are also upgrade wizards that try to migrate your custom configuration to the new one. But again, please test that before you switch and don't switch on the production environment directly. Another new configuration option concerns the sitemap XML generation. You can now configure the XSL file for the sitemaps generated by the SEO extension. So I did this in my case and turned the background color into another color. The original feature request actually was concerned about loading the XSL file from the TYPO3 folder, so they are blocking everything loaded from inside the TYPO3 folder, so they wanted to be able to configure the location to another place that is more in line with their public security policy. Additionally, you can now have multiple sitemaps configured and not only one. So, for example, you can have a pages sitemap and a news sitemap and another news sitemap, depending on where you want to integrate your pages. Let's now take a look at some of the new stuff in TypoScript that you can configure. So these are just random TypoScript parts, basically, that didn't fit into the other topics. So there are, of course, more options. We have new conditions. The first is an example of how you would have needed to do it before the change. So we have the tree in root lines and page UID is not 30, which is now changed to tree root line parent IDs. Then we have the workspace conditions, where you can now check whether the workspace is live or not, or if we are in the workspace at all. We have a new change in the files processor, where you can now use standard wrap capabilities on the references field. So as you can see here, I'm using references.data to be able to use content from the level media field and slide it. And then we have the bitwise AND operator in standard wrap if. So you can check on fields that store bitwise information easier than before. For example, the L18N CFG field is a bit field, and you can now use the bit AND operator to check its value. Let's now talk about site management and what changed with site handling in TYPO3 in version 10. First of all, the website title field got moved from the sys template where it was before to the site settings. So you can now configure the website title at your site configuration module or in the configuration YAML. And it basically works as it did before. Just the location changed and is a bit more logical because it belongs to this site. Then we have a feature that if you create a new root page, as I'm currently doing, a site configuration is automatically generated for you. So you don't have to do anything to get it working, but we are auto-generating a basic configuration file, which you can of course delete and then recreate however you want. But this is just to avoid errors. Also, if you are building distribution packages for others to use, you can now provide a site configuration with that distribution. Just put it into the initialization site folder, and it will be installed when your distribution gets installed. As you can see, we did that for the introduction package to have the basic language configuration in place after you install the introduction package. Additionally, there were also some changes that are more interesting for integrators, I guess. You can now store settings on your site configuration, which will be loaded or overload the type of script constants. So you can use this to store constant-like information on the site configuration and then use that in either the TypoScript constants or the tsconfig. So for example, what we see here is the login form PID is configured in the site settings and gets loaded as constant in the TypoScript object browser. So the syntax just follows the same tree. And I would recommend to do that for all PID related stuff that you want to use independent of the context. For example, in earlier versions, you often had the problem that you needed the PIDs both in tsconfig or in the front-end configuration TypoScript, or even in the command line, and then you ended up loading TypoScript in the command line via the TypoScript front-end controller, which kind of was weird. So now with TYPO3 version 10, you have the possibility to add that to the site configuration and just store it in a single place and use it everywhere where you might need it with a nice and smooth API. One of the features that has been implemented into the TYPO3 YAML loader from the start was that you could use environment variables with placeholders like the %env thing to load configuration variables from the environment. And in newer TYPO3 versions, you can also use that in import files. So you can, for example, load a file called %env foo YAML, which loads the environment variable foo content.yaml file. So you can have different files loaded dependent on the environment. And then somebody had the feature request that we not only want to provide configuration from the environment, but want custom placeholders that we can replace however we like with our own custom logic. So that's what we implemented, and I want to show you an example of how you can use that in your project and how you would have to handle your custom placeholders that you can then use everywhere the TYPO3 core YAML loader is used, so not only in site configuration, but basically everywhere that we are using YAML. So first of all, let's take a look at what we want to achieve here. So I have my site configuration and I have the website title here, and I want to implement a custom placeholder called Susie says hello. So in this case, the placeholder is called Susie says, and the argument it gets in this case, hello. So how to achieve that? We have a small extension, or I have a small extension for that, which will take that string that we can see here and replace it with something more sensible. First of all, we have a xlocalconf PHP file where we add our custom placeholder processor to YAML loader placeholder processors. The custom placeholder processor itself implements an interface, the placeholder processor interface, which needs to have two methods. So it needs to have the method canProcess and process. CanProcess is a Boolean method that returns true if this placeholder is used, and process then processes the actual value. In this case, the extension is actually pretty stupid because it just replaces the word hello with moin or returns the value. So basically, if you write hello, then it will say moin. And if you write anything else, then it will just return the string to you. So it's pretty easy. So we just saw how to do that in less than 2 minutes, and you can implement all your custom placeholders. You can also have multiple placeholder processors, or even process all the values all the time. So what you see is that the canProcess method actually checks the string for the existence of the placeholder to return true. But if you would return true always, then you could always process the value. So let's see what you will build with that. Let's move on to the next topic. Many of you probably know the page renderer in TYPO3. Don't worry, it's still there. But we introduced a new feature called Asset Collector, which can also be used to add CSS and JavaScript to your website. It works a bit differently, and I can show you a basic example of the asset collector in use. So this is my TypoScript setup, which basically doesn't include anything anymore. I emptied it all out and decided I want to actually load the files where I'm using them. So I want to do that in my template. And because it makes sense, I am doing it directly in the layout in this case. So let's look at the layout. we have a few new view helpers with the asset collector to make the usage easier from Fluid. So we have asset CSS and asset scripts, and you can basically use it like you do in TypoScript. So you have an identifier and a page, and it gets loaded via the page renderer in the end. So this is just the same thing, isn't it? So why did we do it? Well, it has the advantage that if you have multiple snippets that use scripts or CSS, you can add all these files directly in your snippets. For example, you have a partial for a content element, and you can add the CSS for that content element directly there. And as long as the identifiers are the same, it only gets added once. So basically, every template and every element could have their own CSS JavaScript files attached to them directly. And it wouldn't matter that you have the same content element multiple times on a website, because the CSS is just rendered and added once. So this makes it easier to have a modular approach on handling CSS and JavaScript assets for your website in TYPO3 in version 10. You can also use the API from the PHP side, of course. I just showed the view helper because the example is a bit easier here. And basically, the asset collector can do all the things that the page renderer did. And in comparison, it can also do a lot more, because we don't have a restriction on which tags you can set on, for example, a script tag. So with the page renderer, we always had the problem that every new attribute you wanted to have needed to be programmed in. So, for example, there was a change in version 10 to allow the no module attribute for script tags. So this always needed a core change. With the asset collector, you can simply add that attribute and all other attributes that you want without having to change the type of the core or implement additional stuff. It's just configuration. As you might have heard earlier, we introduced password reset functionality in TYPO3. And if you saw the email that was sent when using that password reset, you saw that that was actually pretty nice looking in comparison to earlier versions and mails sent from TYPO3. That's because we introduced fluid styled emails in TYPO3 version 10. So what you can do now is configure TYPO3 to send nice looking emails by default. By default, you get something like what you saw just in the screen, and you can configure that a bit by changing the backend colors in the settings module and adding a logo, for example. And if we send a test mail now after we changed the color, we will see that these variables are taken into account in the default layout already. This is what can be done with a simple configuration in the backend settings module. So now it's my favorite color, actually. And this is just the small things, but maybe we want to have our own custom email layout. I don't know why anybody would want to really do custom email layouts, because I hate doing email layouts. But anyway, you can now configure the fluid path in the local configuration file, as you can see. So you have layout root path and template root path as you are used to from Fluid, and you can add templates and layouts for the emails. And what we just saw was system email template, and it looks like this. This is basically the copy of the default email template, and I just did some smaller text changes in my website. You can also see that the configuration options from the backend are used here to change the color and display the logo. And we have an own class to render the copyright notice. All this can be used in the HTML version of the template and also in the plain text version, where you obviously need to do a strip text to not get HTML in your template. So this can be used everywhere, and a lot of system emails have already been implemented to use the new Fluid-based emails, but we would recommend you also do that for all emails that you will send. So there's a PHP API that you can use for that. Let's take a look at that PHP API. So basically, we have a new class that's called Fluid Email, as you can see here. And you can use that as you would the non-fluid email, actually. And it's based on the Symfony mailer, which is implemented via an adapter in the TYPO3 core. So the technology behind mail sending in TYPO3 version 10 changed and is now based on Symfony mailer and Symfony MIME to allow a more modern mail API. And we switched from Swift mailer there. And basically, you can already see with this example what you need to send a nice looking fluid-based email based on the Symfony mailer component. One of my favorite features in TYPO3 version 10 is the new dependency injection. In TYPO3 for a long time, only XBase had a concept for injecting dependencies, while the rest of the core had no such thing, making it hard to get streamlined code that worked everywhere. With version 10, we now have PSR 11 compatible Symfony-based dependency injection in the whole of the TYPO3 core. Let's take a quick look at an example of what we are talking about here. A controller, for example, might need a service class as dependency to get data or configuration to continue to work with that. In XBase, the controller would usually not instantiate that service directly, but rather use dependency injection, for example, with an inject method or constructor injection. In previous TYPO3 versions, only XBase had that possibility. So with one of the three ways, actually. So you could use the inject method thing, the constructor injection, or a property injection. Outside of XBase, however, we had no concept of dependency injection. Instead, we mostly instantiated classes and their dependencies by using general utility make instance everywhere. So starting with TYPO3 version 10, we now have the Symfony dependency injection container everywhere, which is actually the one you know from Symfony already if you did any Symfony at all. So you can use the same API for injecting dependencies in XBase, in TYPO3, and in Symfony. So this makes life a lot easier. And when you are migrating from the XBase dependency injection, please note that you should not continue to use property injection because that part is actively discouraged and will not work with the new Symfony dependency injection container. If you have no experience with the Symfony dependency injection component, that's no problem either, because both we as well as the Symfony people documented that pretty good, so you can get started by reading the documentation either on our docs side or on the Symfony side. I want to avoid to go into too much detail here because there's really a lot of stuff you can do with the dependency injection container, and we just have a bit of time left, and this would be a whole talk in itself. But let's at least look at an example of where to find the DI configuration in the TYPO3 core and how it's used. So basically what we have here is the main controller of the admin panel TYPO3 extension, which I'm just using as an example for something with a small controller that has some dependencies. As you can see, it uses the module loader, the URI builder, and the configuration service as dependencies. All three are declared in the constructor and expected to be handed over by the dependency injection container. To make this work, we have a services configuration in the admin panel extension. It's in a file called services.yaml in the configuration folder and contains the basic configuration for the DI container. The configuration values are documented, and I urge you to look that up to get a better handle on things, on what's happening here. But basically, we are registering all classes in the classes folder in the namespace TYPO3 CMS admin panel in this case. Additionally, as you can see, multiple other features are implemented via the dependency injection component. In this file, we have, for example, a new way to register a cache via dependency injection, and we override the core implementation of a class by aliasing it to another one. So this is basically, if you want, you could call it a new way of X-classing stuff. There's a lot of new stuff in TYPO3 version 10, depending on a good understanding of the dependency injection component. So really familiarize yourself with it before you continue to work with TYPO3 version 10. And one thing you need to remember is when getting started with dependency injection in TYPO3, you will switch from the configuration to code and back a lot of times and try stuff out. To do so, you have to clear the TYPO3 cache via the install tool to ensure that the service container, the dependency injection container, is rebuilt. Otherwise, you will not get your changes, and that can take a lot of time to realize that. If you're currently not using dependency injection in XBase, but instead you still use the object manager get method, you should migrate that to dependency injection and now to the core dependency injection where possible, because we basically deprecated object manager get, and it will probably be removed in some future version. There's a migration guide available helping you to figure out from in what case you should move to which implementation to make that a bit easier. In the following sections, we will see some more features that are based on the dependency injection component, so stay with me. One of the bigger features based on the Symfony dependency injection component is the PSR14 Event Handling in TYPO3 version 10. That's a new solution for intercepting and extending code. With PSR14 integrated into the TYPO3 core, we can now use events instead of signals and hooks that we used in previous versions. And ideally, we only have the concept of events in the future, but we're not there yet. If you take a look at the goal section of the PSR14 definition, you see that the goal of the standard is to have common interfaces for dispatching and handling events, allowing developers to create libraries that can interact with many other frameworks and other libraries in a common fashion. So this has the advantage that we have a streamlined concept here that is also used in other frameworks and all over the PHP world and isn't our own concept. And also we can maybe get to a consistent API. For example, if you work with hooks in the parse, then you know that to get how a hook works, you have to look at the code that implements it, because it isn't clear just from the hook how to call it. And as events are objects, you also get autocompletion in phpstorm or whatever IDE you're using, and defined event objects that have defined behavior, and it's not some array you get passed by reference and you don't know what's happening next. We will look at an example now. So first, let's look at what we want to achieve. If you log into the TYPO3 backend, you have the system information toolbar on top, and you can actually extend that system information toolbar with your own information. In my case, I want to display the Git revision I'm on, so I quickly see which version of my website is currently running. To implement that, we have to register an event listener. And let's switch to the code and look at the TYPO3 system status extension I have here. So we have a services.yaml file where we have registered the class showGitRevision as an event listener via a tag. So you define the event that is listening to and the class that shall be called. In this case, it's the class showGitRevision. And as I did not specify a method to be called, the class will be called via invoke. So this is what I'm implementing here. And then that results in having the Git version in that system information toolbar. You can also take a look at the event listener section in the configuration module in the backend, where you get a list of all registered event listeners. That's not all events, but all registered listeners. So for example, my new show Git revision is part of this configuration now. Remember that you have to clear the caches in the install tool to make use of that, because we changed the services.yaml file. Another thing is that you can also see all the events, and this is all the events that happened during the page rendering in the admin panel. So if you are looking for a specific event where you can change the rendering of the page, you might open the admin panel and see which events were triggered on the current rendering run. So this hopefully makes it a bit easier to find out which events exist and how to use them, because we also have the properties with which they are called. This is actually another Symfony component, the Symfony var dumper in this case. So the current state of the event handling in TYPO3 is that we migrated all signals and slots to events. So if you're using signals and slots in your extensions, you can migrate them to events in version 10. We did not manage to do that for all the hooks. That's the plan. So we have only one event system in place in the future. There are a lot of examples around already for implementations of events in TYPO3, and maybe the easiest ones are in the core itself. So for example, you can take a look at how the link validator uses events to analyze broken links, or you can look at various block entries around already to see how others are using the event component and also using more advanced stuff, for example, clearing the cache via an event trigger. It's pretty interesting and a lot of fun. One other thing you probably noticed during the presentation, or when you saw TYPO3 version 10 before, is that we have a new starting module in TYPO3, the dashboard. The dashboard extension is used to build custom dashboards that can serve as an entry point for your editors or administrators or yourself. And you can add widgets there. We deliver a few of them with the TYPO3 course. So for example, we have widgets related to the system information, like the type of backend users, the number of errors in the log, the number of failed backend logins. So you can have a system dashboard where you display all these informations. You can also add all the widgets multiple times, so it doesn't matter if they are on more than one dashboard. And you can also move around all the widgets via drag and drop to customize that a bit more. Then, of course, the more interesting thing is that you can configure TYPO3 to deliver your own widgets. So what I did in this case was I built a configuration that contained all the blocks I read on a regular basis. So this is basically TYPO3 blocks, TYPO3 blocks, TYPO3 blocks. And I'm just building a dashboard where I can see all those blocks in one place while logging in to my TYPO3 website. So I don't have to have a specific reader or something like that. Just scroll through it on my personalized dashboard here. And maybe you can guess already, but these widgets, they are also implemented based on the TYPO3 new dependency injection container. So let's take a look at that in the next part. So we switch to my phpstorm and have a look at the configuration of all these new widgets that we just saw. So this is the services YAML file of my site extension, and this is where I configured all these widgets. So I didn't write my own custom widgets yet. I just configured the existing RSS widget to display different RSS feeds. So basically, this is always the same. So it's a lot of copy and paste involved here. I'm switching the description and the URL, and the rest is the same for everything. So you have basically a tag and a configuration. If you want to see more widgets and examples for how widgets can be configured, there's the dashboard widgets YAML file in the TYPO3 core dashboard extension, which configures all the base widgets. You can see here the configuration of all the buttons that can be used in the widgets. And if you scroll through that, you also find the chart widgets. I'm going through it a bit faster here. So this is a CTA widget, CTA widget, CTA widget. So still the basically linked to the documentation. And then we have here type of users, which is the donut chart widget, which is configured with custom data provider, which delivers the data for that chart. So the different widget types are documented, and most of them can be used without you having to be able to write a lot of code just via configuration. And even those that need a bit of code, like the widgets based on charts, which need a data provider, only need that data provider. So you don't need to fiddle with building charts yourself or CSS or stuff like that. So most things can probably be done by just making use of the base widget types that we have. But if you want to have more complex stuff because you want to provide your editors entry points for their most used tasks, for example, then you can build your complete custom widgets. There are interfaces that you can implement, and actually there's documentation which shows you how to do that. So we have basically a difference between widgets that are just configuration, widgets where you need to provide data, and your own custom widgets that you need to build completely from the ground up to provide really custom stuff in your project. But while the core doesn't deliver a lot of widgets by itself, there's a widget extension on the Friends of TYPO3 GitHub repository where you can find a few more implementations. And additionally, I'd urge you to build custom widgets that make sense in your project, because dashboards can be a great way to get editors where they need to be in their context in your project, but only you know how that might look like. So this is the dashboards in TYPO3 version 10.